Texas, late autumn 1944. The train screeched to a stop under a sky brushed with pale orange dust. German prisoners, thin and silent, stepped down one by one, their boots crunching on gravel, their eyes narrow and wary. For months they had imagined what capture by the Americans would mean. Many expected retribution, hunger, humiliation. Instead, they were met with stillness. No shouting, no rifle butts, no violence. Only an orderly line of U.S. guards, uniforms pressed, faces expressionless. Behind them, wooden barracks stood neat and symmetrical, surrounded by barbed wire gleaming in the sun. A sergeant pointed toward a doorway. Inside, rows of clean beds. White sheets. Real pillows. The faint scent of soap and pine. One of the Germans whispered, almost disbelieving, "Das ist Luxus." This is luxury. A few laughed nervously. Others stared, unsure if it was a trick. But when warm food arrived and they saw guards offering coffee, not commands, the shock turned to quiet disbelief. They had entered a different kind of battlefield, one fought not with guns, but with humanity. By late 1944, the Second World War was approaching its final, brutal stretch. Across Europe, the German army was collapsing under the combined weight of Allied offensives. In Normandy, the beaches once painted with blood had become supply arteries pushing deep into France. In Italy, the Wehrmacht fought a desperate retreat northward. And on the Eastern Front, the Red Army was closing in from the Vistula to the Carpathians. As victory loomed for the Allies, a new logistical challenge emerged. What to do with the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners captured in North Africa, France, and later, Western Europe. Britain's camps were overcrowded. Continental Europe was too unstable to host them safely. The United States, with its vast land, organized infrastructure, and industrial might, became the natural solution. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 370,000 German POWs were shipped across the Atlantic. They arrived in convoys that once carried tanks and ammunition outward, now returning with human cargo, soldiers who only weeks earlier had fought to destroy the very nation that now fed them. In Washington, the U.S. War Department viewed the project as both humanitarian and strategic. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners be treated humanely, but the Americans went further. They saw in this mass custody an opportunity to demonstrate the moral superiority of democracy itself. If the Axis had ruled through fear, the Allies would rule through discipline, order, and decency. The camps were placed mostly in the heartland, Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, far from the coasts, deep in America's agricultural spine. These were regions with ample land and access to rail lines, but also communities accustomed to discipline and work. Farmers saw a potential labor force. The Army saw security in space. Every camp was built with military precision. Rows of wooden barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, libraries, and fenced recreation yards formed self-contained worlds. Guard towers rose above the wire, but the fences themselves were often secondary to the structure of respect the Americans expected to maintain. The men who arrived were not a single type. Some were battle-hardened veterans from North Africa. Others were young conscripts captured in France. Among them were officers, medics, engineers, and clerks, a mirror of Germany's wartime society. They carried exhaustion, resentment, and, for many, a lifetime of propaganda about American brutality. That illusion dissolved the moment they touched U.S. soil. At the port of arrival, often New York, Norfolk, or Boston, they saw order instead of chaos, efficiency instead of vengeance. Their first medical checks included vaccinations, dental inspections, and clean uniforms marked PW. Their meals met caloric standards equal to those of American soldiers. It was regulation, not sentiment, that enforced it. But to the prisoners, it felt almost merciful. When they boarded trains headed south or west, the landscape unfolded like another planet. Endless fields, clean towns, women driving cars, children waving from crossings, scenes utterly foreign to men raised in the shadow of dictatorship and war. For the U.S. Army, humane treatment was not weakness. It was policy with purpose. Officials like Major General Allen W. Gullion, Provost Marshal General, argued that proper care of German POWs would encourage reciprocal treatment for Americans held in Axis camps. More quietly, strategists recognized another benefit. Every respectful interaction was a small blow to Nazi ideology. Letters home, censored but allowed, carried fragments of this revelation back to Germany. Prisoners wrote of American organization, abundance, and fairness. They described guards who enforced rules without cruelty. They marveled at food variety, bread, meat, vegetables, and the strange notion of being addressed by rank even as captives. The U.S. was, in effect, conducting a psychological campaign without firing a shot. Each camp became a microcosm of democratic order, a stage on which the defeated could witness the victor's values. The journey of these prisoners, however, was only beginning. Beyond the fences lay small American towns whose residents would soon work beside them, feed them, and in rare cases befriend them. For many Germans, the first taste of America was not battle or propaganda, but the smell of clean sheets, the hum of electric lights, and the quiet efficiency of a system that didn't need to shout its power. And as more trains arrived, the experiment grew. The United States had proven it could win with weapons. Now it would prove it could conquer with decency. The experiment expanded across the American landscape with remarkable speed and order. By mid-1944, more than 500 major prisoner of war camps and nearly 500 subcamps dotted the United States. The heart of this network lay in Texas, where open land and mild winters made construction easier and discipline more manageable. Camps at Herne, Huntsville, and Hereford became names whispered among German ranks, first with fear, then with bewilderment. From above, a typical camp resembled a small military town. Barracks were laid out in grids, each capable of housing 250 men. Within the wire, a POW could find almost everything found in a U.S. Army post: a mess hall, hospital, chapel, theater, even classrooms. American planners understood that idleness bred defiance, so they filled the days with labor, study, and routine. Revel sounded at dawn. Breakfast followed in clean canteens where prisoners, supervised by guards, served themselves from metal trays: oatmeal, eggs, coffee. At roll call, names were checked against rosters prepared with German precision. Work assignments soon followed. Many were sent into the fields, aiding American farmers whose sons were fighting overseas. Others repaired roads, cut timber, or built irrigation channels. Their wages, small, symbolic, could be spent at camp canteens on cigarettes, toiletries, or American magazines. It was work under guard, yes, but it carried an unexpected dignity. The U.S. military adhered to the Geneva Convention's labor rules, separating enlisted men from officers and forbidding any task linked to combat production. The result was order without cruelty, labor without degradation. Reports from Camp Herne described German craftsmen building furniture, staging theater plays, and even forming orchestras. At night, when the floodlights buzzed on, violins echoed across the barbed wire, softening the hum of the Texas plains. For many Americans living nearby, that music, Schubert, Bach, sometimes swing, was their first encounter with their enemies as human beings. The contrast to Europe was staggering. At the same moment, German cities lay in ruins from Allied bombing. Food was rationed and civilian morale was collapsing. Yet here, on the other side of the world, captured soldiers found warmth and routine. Some locals were startled by the fairness extended to men who had once worn the enemy's uniform. Newspapers ran headlines like "Nazis eat steak while GIs fight overseas," stirring resentment among families who endured rationing. But the War Department stood firm. Treating prisoners well, officials argued, was not charity. It was discipline. Every American guard was reminded that cruelty reflected weakness, not strength. The goal was control through consistency. If prisoners respected the system, escapes would be rare, and indeed they were. In Texas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska, escape attempts were uncommon and often half-hearted. Few men wished to risk the endless miles of farmland and the near certainty of recapture. Many, in fact, had begun to see the camp as a temporary sanctuary, a place of order amid the chaos that had consumed Europe. Each camp maintained an education program designed by the War Department's Special Projects Division. Under American supervision, German academics among the prisoners taught courses in mathematics, literature, and even political science. The intention was subtle but deliberate: to reintroduce the ideas of democracy, reason, and civic order to men who had lived under a totalitarian regime. Mail from home reinforced the contrast. Letters arrived describing bombed cities, hunger, and the collapse of morale. Prisoners who once boasted of German superiority now fell silent at the evening news bulletins transmitted over loudspeakers, reports of Allied advances, Hitler's desperate orders, and the encirclement of German armies. Some guards noticed the change. The arrogance of early arrivals faded into quiet reflection. A few began to ask questions about American life, about elections, about the Constitution they heard mentioned in radio broadcasts. The United States was, without declaring it, conducting one of the most profound ideological experiments of the war. By the end of 1944, the camps had stabilized into a rhythm that blurred the line between captivity and coexistence. Locals traded goods through fences, shared music, and occasionally conversation. A strange peace settled over these outposts of war, fragile but real. For the Germans inside, the experience was bewildering. They had prepared for hardship and humiliation. Instead, they found rules, fairness, and something they had not known in years: predictability. Each night, when lights dimmed and guards walked their rounds, a few prisoners whispered the same phrase that had started it all: "This is luxury." Yet beneath that quiet routine, deeper tensions and revelations were forming. Moments that would test belief, loyalty, and identity itself. The next part of the story reveals how those reactions unfolded, through human, tactical, and moral angles that defined this extraordinary chapter of World War II. For most of the captured Germans, the journey to the United States was their first encounter with the enemy as a human being. In the chaos of the front lines, the American had been reduced to an abstract, a faceless opponent, defined by propaganda as decadent and weak. But when the prisoners stepped into their new environment, the myth began to fracture. At first, suspicion ruled. Some refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. Others stood at attention whenever a U.S. officer passed, fearing punishment for not saluting. Guards, instructed to maintain calm professionalism, responded not with hostility but with routine. Clear orders, polite enforcement, minimal shouting. That quiet predictability disarmed the men faster than any threat could. Within weeks, a rhythm emerged. Prisoners cleaned their own barracks, cooked under supervision, and organized internal leadership through elected spokesmen, a structure that mirrored their army hierarchy, but functioned under American oversight. Gradually, fear softened into a strange respect. Letters and diaries recovered after the war reveal this emotional shift. One former Luftwaffe mechanic wrote, "We were prepared for camps like Siberia. Instead, we were treated as soldiers. They even gave us books." Another described seeing American guards share cigarettes with prisoners during night shifts. Small gestures carried immense weight. There was still resentment, still pride, but the human encounter began to erode ideological distance. Many prisoners came to see their captors not as conquerors, but as disciplined professionals following an ethical code, a mirror of what they had once believed Germany embodied. And in that realization lay the quiet start of a moral reversal. Behind the scenes, the U.S. Army's management of the POW system was a feat of military logistics rivaling its overseas operations. Each camp functioned like a miniature army post, a closed ecosystem powered by precision, discipline, and supply chains that stretched across the continent. Quartermasters coordinated food, uniforms, and medical supplies through the same routes feeding active divisions in Europe. The U.S. War Department established regional commands to standardize administration. Military police units rotated on schedule, preventing familiarity from turning to favoritism or abuse. Inspections were regular and strict. Representatives of the International Red Cross were allowed access to verify conditions, ensuring compliance with international law. Any mistreatment risked diplomatic repercussions. For the Americans, efficiency and legality were inseparable. Every bedsheet, every calorie ration, every hour of work was logged, reviewed, and justified. It was this system, not sentiment, that produced the conditions so many prisoners described as luxury. Clean barracks existed because regulations demanded hygiene. Balanced meals were served because nutrition was essential for discipline and productivity. Yet to men raised under scarcity and chaos, this order felt like grace. In wartime America, such organization was an expression of national character. The same industrial logic that produced thousands of bombers and tanks also produced a humane system for managing enemies. The efficiency of the U.S. military machine extended beyond weapons. It reached into the moral structure of the war effort itself. Every bed made, every rule enforced was another quiet demonstration that democracy did not mean disorder. For the Germans watching it in action, this was perhaps the most unsettling revelation of all. From within the wire, the cultural world of America unfolded like a series of distant moving images. The prisoners worked on farms, repaired roads, or loaded grain, often under open skies with small towns nearby. They saw women driving tractors, black and white soldiers eating in the same mess halls, children walking to school with lunch pails, scenes unimaginable in wartime Europe. The cultural shock was profound. Some German officers, steeped in the rigid hierarchies of the Reich, struggled to process what they saw. Women in positions of authority, civilians addressing soldiers casually, newspapers criticizing government officials without fear. These observations circulated quietly among the prisoners and began to erode long-held assumptions about American weakness and decadence. At Camp Herne, a guard recalled a German engineer asking how it was possible that enlisted men could question orders without punishment. The American replied simply, "Because that's how we learn." It was a conversation that lingered long after the shift ended. Inside the camps, the prisoners encountered fragments of American life through the most ordinary details. Music on shortwave radios, advertisements in magazines, and the casual humor of guards discussing baseball scores or movie stars. Many were fascinated by American slang, by jazz, by the relaxed informality that contrasted so sharply with their own military culture. For young German conscripts, America represented both confusion and curiosity, a society that could build enormous power without crushing individuality. They had been told democracy was weakness. What they witnessed was strength built on cooperation and confidence. This cultural exposure was not designed as propaganda, yet it achieved what no leaflet or broadcast could. It offered a living, breathing example of freedom functioning in order. Through these first angles, human, logistical, and cultural, the story of America's POW camps becomes more than an anecdote of kindness. It becomes evidence of a national character, efficient, disciplined, and quietly self-assured. But this was only half the story. Beneath the calm surface of camp life, deeper ideological and moral battles were taking shape, inside the minds of the prisoners and in the strategies of their captors. For many captured officers, the early months of captivity were a quiet humiliation. These were men raised on images of German superiority, the invincible Wehrmacht, the precision of German engineering, the discipline of the Reich. Yet as they observed American efficiency up close, that pride began to falter. They watched as guards handled logistics with flawless coordination, as food and supplies arrived with mathematical regularity. The sheer abundance of resources, fuel, vehicles, machinery, defied everything Nazi propaganda had promised about a decadent United States. Officers wrote home in guarded language, describing unexpected conditions and American order. Some in private journals were more direct. One captain captured in Normandy recorded, "It is impossible not to admire their system. Everything functions. Everyone knows his duty. There is no waste, no shouting." The emotional struggle ran deep. To admire the enemy was to question one's own cause. Many tried to preserve loyalty by attributing American success to material wealth rather than ideology. Yet the longer they lived within the system, the harder that illusion became to maintain. For every efficient camp schedule and every fair rule enforced without cruelty, the contrast grew sharper. The German officers who once mocked democracy as chaos now saw discipline without tyranny, power without fear. It was a lesson that would linger long after the war ended. The humane treatment of German POWs was not simply charity. It was a deliberate psychological operation. American planners recognized that the moral conduct of a victor could influence the defeated more profoundly than any weapon. In internal memoranda from the War Department's Special Projects Division, officers discussed the goal of reorientation through example. They believed that exposure to fair treatment, lawful order, and material abundance could undermine Nazi ideology from within. It was, in effect, a moral counteroffensive. Each time a guard enforced a rule calmly, each time a prisoner was granted due process in a disciplinary hearing, a small fracture appeared in the myth of American barbarism. Prisoners who experienced justice firsthand began to doubt the propaganda they had once believed. This strategy reached beyond the wire. German POWs were allowed, under supervision, to read selected newspapers, attend lectures, and participate in discussions about post-war reconstruction. The Americans knew that these men would eventually return home, and what they said about their captors could shape Germany's future attitude toward the United States. It was a war of ideas, fought quietly in dining halls and recreation yards. Psychologists working with the army reported subtle but significant changes. Hostility declined. Cooperation increased. In some camps, prisoners began organizing self-governing committees, promoting order from within. A few even volunteered for re-education groups that discussed democracy, freedom of the press, and individual responsibility, concepts banned under the Reich. Kindness, it turned out, was disarming. By treating prisoners with respect, the Americans did more than uphold international law. They offered living proof that strength did not require brutality. The lesson was not lost on the men who had once believed the opposite. While the moral and psychological impact was profound, the POW camps also played a vital economic role in wartime America. With millions of young men overseas, the country faced severe labor shortages, especially in agriculture and manufacturing. The U.S. government, following the Geneva Convention's rules, authorized work programs that employed POWs in non-military labor. From 1943 onward, German prisoners harvested crops, built levees, repaired roads, and processed lumber under guard supervision. Their pay, deposited in controlled accounts, could be spent in camp canteens or saved for repatriation. In Texas alone, tens of thousands of POWs worked the cotton and peanut fields. In Iowa and Nebraska, they staffed canning factories and helped maintain railway lines. American farmers, initially skeptical, came to rely on their efficiency. Newspapers of the time recorded remarkable scenes: German prisoners singing as they picked fruit, farmers shaking hands across the fence at day's end, guards reading English lessons aloud during breaks. The work was hard but fair, and for many Germans it was the first time they labored without fear of arbitrary punishment. The economic utility of these camps quietly reinforced their moral purpose. By demonstrating that even enemies could contribute productively under humane conditions, the U.S. projected confidence, the confidence of a nation that could afford generosity because it was secure in its strength. When the harvest succeeded and factories met quotas, local communities softened. Suspicion gave way to pragmatism. Many Americans realized that their enemy looked, worked, and behaved not so differently from themselves. The system produced more than food and materials. It produced understanding, and in doing so, it began to dissolve the psychological boundaries that war had built. Through these angles, enemy perception, moral strategy, and economic integration, the story of America's POW camps evolves beyond simple kindness. It becomes a demonstration of national power expressed through restraint, intelligence, and principle. Yet the most powerful moments were still to come. As the war neared its end and Germany collapsed, news from home changed everything. And inside those quiet camps, the psychological turning point arrived. By the winter of 1944-45, the tone inside America's POW camps had changed. The men who had once carried themselves like soldiers of a conquering army were now subdued, reflective, and uneasy. The world they had left behind was collapsing. The Reich they had sworn to defend was burning. Radio bulletins, played under guard supervision, carried grim news each week. The Allies advancing on the Rhine, Dresden in flames, Hitler's voice fading into desperation. Prisoners gathered in silence around the speakers, faces pale and motionless. Some whispered prayers. Others stared at the floor. For the Americans, these broadcasts were not just updates. They were turning points. The psychological center of gravity shifted. The POWs were no longer warriors temporarily removed from battle. They were witnesses to their nation's destruction from afar. At Camp Hearn in Texas, guards noticed the change first. The arrogance that had marked many German officers was gone. They no longer barked commands at their men. The camp orchestra began playing softer, slower music, no longer marches but quiet classical pieces. A U.S. chaplain later recalled, "You could feel the defeat settling into them like cold. And yet in that defeat something unexpected happened. As the old ideology cracked, curiosity began to fill the void. Prisoners who once dismissed American life as superficial now sought to understand it. They asked about elections, about newspapers, about how ordinary soldiers could question orders. Some attended voluntary democracy classes, led by U.S. Army education officers and visiting professors. These programs were cautious, tightly controlled. They did not aim to humiliate or convert, but to explain. Lectures on government ethics and civic responsibility replaced the propaganda that had shaped so many of the prisoners' early lives. The Americans called it reorientation. For some, it was too much. The die-hard loyalists, particularly those from elite SS or Luftwaffe units, saw this exposure to democratic values as dangerous contamination. They formed small groups within the camps, enforcing silence, sometimes intimidation. Informal courts sprang up in barracks at night, judging those deemed traitors for speaking positively about America. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, one such episode ended in tragedy. A German prisoner suspected of collaborating with U.S. officials was beaten and hanged by his peers. The incident shocked both guards and fellow prisoners, prompting tighter surveillance and stricter segregation of ideological hardliners. But the majority of inmates, disillusioned by the war's outcome and the brutality of their own extremists, began to see the situation differently. For the first time, many recognized that the world they had believed in was collapsing, not because of American propaganda, but because it had been built on lies. Letters arriving from Germany deepened this realization. Families described bombed cities, shortages, and chaos. Mothers wrote of hunger. Children begged for food or safety. The words "no home" appeared again and again. To men sitting on clean bunks, eating regular meals, and earning small wages under fair supervision, the contrast was unbearable. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "I am ashamed to live better here than my wife and children at home. The enemy feeds me. My own country abandons them." For guards, these confessions were telling. They revealed not only despair, but also a subtle shift in allegiance, not to America, but away from the old faith. As news of Hitler's suicide reached the camps in late April 1945, silence fell across the compounds. There were no cheers, no tears, only disbelief. Some refused to believe it. Others wept quietly, not for the Führer, but for the final collapse of everything familiar. In one camp, a U.S. officer described the moment. They stood there, staring through the fence. You could see the realization dawning, that the world they had fought for was gone. That night, American guards reported an eerie calm. The lights in the barracks burned later than usual. The next morning, the camp's German spokesman requested a memorial service for the dead of all nations. Permission was granted. It was a symbolic act, a small but profound step toward reconciliation, born from exhaustion and understanding rather than politics. The climax of this story was not a battle, but a quiet surrender of belief. The same men who had once laughed at American simplicity now whispered about fairness, order, and decency as virtues worth preserving. The U.S. had won more than the war. It had won the moral contest. And yet what came next, the months after Germany's unconditional surrender, would reveal how deep this transformation truly went, and how reluctant some prisoners were to leave the strange peace they had found behind barbed wire. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The guns fell silent, but inside the barbed wire fences of America's POW camps, silence carried a different weight. When the news came through shortwave radio, prisoners stood motionless. For many, it was not relief but emptiness. The cause they had fought for, the nation that had defined their identity, had vanished overnight. They were no longer soldiers. They were stateless men in uniform, unsure what awaited them beyond the fence. In Camp Hearn, guards reported that German prisoners lined up voluntarily for morning roll call, out of habit, not order. Discipline had become a form of dignity, a way to keep something intact while everything else collapsed. Others simply sat in the sun staring at the horizon, whispering about families they might never see again. A new phase began. The Americans, following Allied policy, began preparing for Operation Keystone, the vast program to repatriate millions of Axis prisoners worldwide. Yet the mood in the camps was complex. Repatriation was supposed to mean freedom, but for many Germans in the United States, it felt like exile in reverse. They had lived for months, some for years, in clean, organized, and predictable surroundings. They had eaten 3 meals a day, worked honestly, and seen order without cruelty. The idea of returning to a ruined homeland under Soviet or Allied occupation filled them with dread. At Camp Swift, Texas, an American officer recalled a conversation with a former U-boat mechanic. He told me, "You Americans treat us better than our own officers did. If I go back, I don't know what life there means anymore." That sentiment, once unthinkable, became common. In the final months of captivity, a quiet reversal of emotion took place. The guards who had once represented fear now symbolized security. The enemy's country, vast, organized, calm, had become, in their minds, a place of strange safety. American newspapers began to take note. Articles described prisoners who refused to celebrate Germany's surrender, men who asked to stay on American soil to continue farm work. Some locals were shocked. Others, especially farmers and small-town employers, understood. They had come to rely on these men, and in some cases to respect them. For a few prisoners, the transformation went even further. In educational programs, men who once defended fascism began writing essays praising individual liberty. In recreation huts, others discussed rebuilding Germany on democratic lines. The process was not instant, not universal, but real. When Army photographers visited the camps in the summer of 1945, they captured faces no longer marked by defiance, but by contemplation. Groups of Germans reading newspapers, men sitting quietly beside American guards sharing coffee, a nation's enemies now united in weariness and mutual recognition. The irony was not lost on anyone. The United States, through its discipline, its abundance, and its adherence to law, had turned captivity into a lesson in civilization. It was not propaganda nor sentimentality. It was the demonstration of a functioning moral order. Still, the ending was not without pain. As ships were prepared to return prisoners to Europe, many hesitated to board. Some wrote petitions requesting to remain in America as laborers. Others left farewell gifts for their guards, carved wooden boxes, small sketches, letters of gratitude written in careful English. One message found after the war read simply, "You showed us what strength without hatred looks like." By late 1946, the last major camps began to close. Trainloads of men departed, waving from windows, unsure what waited beyond the Atlantic. For some, it was reunion with family. For others, it was the stark reality of a destroyed homeland. As the final gates closed, a few guards admitted to mixed emotions. They had come to see these prisoners not as symbols of an enemy, but as men caught in the machinery of history. Decency had bridged the divide in ways no treaty could. The psychological victory of the United States was complete, not through intimidation, but through proof. Proof that democratic order could sustain both victory and mercy. Proof that a nation's true power lies not only in its armies, but in the humanity of those who command them. For the men who whispered "this is luxury" on their first night in Texas, the memory would remain for the rest of their lives, not as indulgence, but as revelation. They had entered the camps as enemies. They would leave as witnesses. The closing of the American prisoner of war camps marked the end of one of the largest custodial operations in modern history. Yet the influence of those years did not vanish with the last train. It lingered in memories, in letters, and in a quiet shift of perception that stretched far beyond the barbed wire. When the ships reached Europe in 1946 and 1947, many of the returning Germans stepped onto docks that scarcely resembled home. Hamburg, Bremen, and Kiel were flattened. Roads were broken, families scattered. For men who had slept in clean bunks and eaten regular meals, the devastation was almost incomprehensible. They carried their few possessions in duffel bags stamped U.S. Army PW, a reminder that their most stable period of the war had come in enemy hands. Red Cross officials documented the contrast in a series of post-repatriation interviews. Roughly half of the former prisoners described their treatment as better than expected, a phrase that understated what they truly meant. Many spoke with gratitude, some with guilt. "We were safe while others starved," wrote one. "It is not easy to accept kindness from those you were taught to hate." American authorities had predicted this ambivalence. They knew the memory of decency could be as influential as punishment. In occupied Germany, Allied information officers quietly drew on these testimonies, encouraging former POWs to speak about life in America. Their words became a subtle form of diplomacy. In Bavaria, a small newspaper printed an article titled, "Behind the Wire in Texas." Its author, a former artillery sergeant, described the daily order of camp life, the food, the fairness, the absence of cruelty. The piece circulated widely, reprinted in regional bulletins, and even read aloud in town meetings. To many civilians, it was their first description of the United States not as conqueror, but as functioning democracy. Meanwhile, in America, the public conversation was equally complex. Some citizens resented the leniency shown to men who had fought against their sons. Others took pride in the restraint their nation had demonstrated. Editorials in the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune framed the camps as proof that American justice could withstand the test of hatred. The numbers themselves told a remarkable story. Of the more than 370,000 German POWs held in the United States, fewer than 1% attempted escape, and serious violence remained rare. Red Cross inspections consistently rated conditions as exemplary. The U.S. had managed to house, feed, and employ an army of captives without descending into revenge or chaos, an achievement that impressed even its wartime allies. Yet beyond statistics lay the human residue. Letters continued to arrive from former prisoners thanking individual guards or camp officers. A farmer in Kansas received a photograph of a young German who had worked his fields, standing beside the same tractor they once repaired together. In another case, a guard in Oklahoma received a Christmas card each year for the rest of his life from a man who signed simply, "Your former prisoner, Carl." These gestures were small, but they formed a quiet chain of memory stretching across the Atlantic. They also revealed something profound about the power dynamic of mercy. The act of treating an enemy with dignity transforms both sides. For the returning Germans, that lesson would shape how they rebuilt their society. Many of those who later entered public service, engineering, or education carried fragments of what they had witnessed: organization without oppression, authority without fear, rules that protected rather than humiliated. In post-war surveys, several credited their time in American captivity as the first moment they understood the principles behind democratic order. For the United States, the success of the POW system reinforced a national self-image, a country capable of overwhelming military might and equally overwhelming restraint. The camps became a quiet chapter in the broader narrative of victory, rarely celebrated, but deeply revealing. As Europe struggled to feed its people and redefine its future, the former prisoners spoke softly of America's paradoxical lesson that strength expressed through humanity endures longer than strength expressed through force. Their testimonies would soon feed into the next chapter of history, the uneasy birth of partnership between former enemies. By the late 1940s, a quiet reconciliation had begun to take root. It did not come from official declarations or treaties, but from the memories carried home by thousands of former prisoners who had lived, worked, and reflected behind American fences. For the men who had seen the inside of a U.S. camp, America no longer existed as propaganda had described it. It was not the chaotic, materialistic society portrayed in Nazi newsreels. It was a place of order built on consent rather than compulsion, a system that combined freedom with discipline. This impression, multiplied across tens of thousands of individual recollections, became an undercurrent in the rebuilding of post-war Germany. In local councils, schools, and trade unions, former POWs quietly influenced tone and practice. They spoke not as converts, but as witnesses to another way of organizing life. Sociologists later traced the early foundations of West Germany's democratic culture, in part to this exposure. A 1951 study by the U.S. High Commission in Germany found that ex-POWs from American custody demonstrated measurably higher trust in democratic institutions than those held by other Allied powers. They had seen that discipline and humanity could coexist, that decency was not weakness, and that command did not require fear. In towns like Kassel, Munich, and Stuttgart, community meetings sometimes opened with personal recollections. In the camp, one returned engineer told his neighbors, rules were clear and applied to everyone, even the guards themselves. It was a simple observation: But in a country emerging from dictatorship, it carried enormous moral weight. The story traveled back across the Atlantic as well. American veterans who had guarded those camps found themselves invited decades later to reunions in Germany. They received letters written in careful English. "You once kept watch over me. Now I wish to thank you for the fairness you showed." Historians studying this correspondence describe it as an unplanned diplomacy, a relationship born not of policy, but of conduct. The experience of captivity, when managed with restraint, had become an instrument of healing. Even during the early Cold War, as new tensions divided the world, these memories persisted. Former prisoners, now civilians, resisted the extremes of ideology. They had seen how easily blind loyalty could destroy a nation, and how unexpected kindness could restore dignity. Many raised their children with quiet insistence on personal responsibility and tolerance. In American archives, the official reports of the POW program read like logistical documents: tonnage of food, hours of labor, construction costs. But between those lines lies a story of character, the test of a democracy's ability to remain itself under the strain of total war. It would have been easy for the United States to answer cruelty with cruelty, to mirror the enemy's behavior. Instead, it relied on a different strength, the discipline of fairness. The same logistical precision that produced fleets of bombers and convoys of tanks also produced clean camps, functioning kitchens, and orderly recreation halls. It was efficiency turned toward humanity. As years passed, the memory of those camps faded from public discussion, overshadowed by the battles that defined the war's heroism. Yet for the men who had slept under American roofs as captives, the lesson remained vivid. One former Luftwaffe pilot interviewed in the 1980s put it simply: "I learned more about civilization in 2 years behind American wire than in 10 years of schooling under the Reich." That sentiment, repeated in countless forms, became part of the unwritten legacy of the war, a reminder that moral strength, when expressed through action rather than rhetoric, can outlast any weapon. And so the story of those clean beds, hot meals, and calm voices became more than an anecdote of comfort. It became a quiet symbol of victory, not over an army, but over hatred itself. War tests not only armies, but the principles that guide them. It exposes what nations truly are when stripped of triumph and rhetoric. For the United States, the handling of German prisoners during World War II revealed a strength far beyond military power. It was the strength of restraint, the discipline to uphold humanity in the midst of total war. Clean beds, decent food, honest work, small gestures, yet they spoke louder than propaganda. They demonstrated that a free society could win without surrendering its soul. For the German prisoners, that revelation was profound. They had been raised to see mercy as weakness, compassion as corruption, and democracy as disorder. Yet in American camps, in the quiet rhythm of meals, music, and mutual respect, they saw a functioning moral order. They learned that justice could coexist with generosity, that dignity could survive even in captivity. When they returned home, they carried that memory with them, not as ideology, but as experience, proof that another kind of power existed in the world. A power built not on fear but on fairness. Decades later, as the United States and West Germany stood side by side as allies, the echoes of that moral victory could still be felt. The friendship that emerged from the ruins of war was rooted partly in what those men had witnessed behind American fences, that the enemy who could destroy them had instead chosen to understand them. History often remembers the great battles, Normandy, the Bulge, Iwo Jima, but the quieter victories, the ones fought in the hearts and minds of men, shaped the world that follows. The story of the German prisoners in America is one of those victories, a reminder that even in war, civilization is measured not by the destruction it can unleash, but by the humanity it can preserve.